I'm Dave Laird.
I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Bo Butler. A screaming comes across the sky. It has happened before, but there is nothing to compare it to now. It is too late. The evacuation still proceeds, but it's all theater. There are no lights inside the cars, no light anywhere except the fur of the feral hamsters here in the Great Concavity.
Yeah, all right.
I don't know why, but I've always imagined that the feral hamsters glow for some reason.
That's reasonable.
I don't know where I get that.
Yeah. So of course that was the opening line of Gravity's Rainbow.
Is that a David Foster Wallace novel? I don't recognize that novel. Sorry. Is that David Foster Wallace?
Let's call it maybe the novel without which you wouldn't have David Foster Wallace and therefore this podcast.
Oh yeah, that's probably true.
Okay.
Actually.
So, if you haven't heard of it, that's okay. We covered it over on the Pynchon in Public podcast if you need a little help getting through it.
And
welcome to our show, Bo.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to continue to be hard on you guys for a while, but
ham it up, man.
I do appreciate you having me on the show.
Really, can you give us a breakdown of the best way to pronounce the word Pynchon or Pynchon?
Oh yeah, I was going to ask about this too.
It's a really good question. I had only ever heard Pynchon until I met the former host of the show, my former co-producer Chris. He always called it Pynchon, but he was from like Eastern Pennsylvania, so I thought maybe that was like an East Coast pronunciation. But then that's where the family is kind of from. So I honestly don't know either way. I personally like to say Pynchon just because it also sounds like a verb and it confuses people. And I like to confuse people, so that's what I go with.
Sure. Yeah, I say Pynchon as well.
I just think anything else sounds like super pretentious.
I mean, you're talking about Pynchon, so it's going to sound pretentious, but there's levels of acceptability, and I agree with you there.
So let's back up about a half step and say, welcome, Bo.
Thank you.
To episode 43 of The Great Concavity.
Pynchon in Public is our longtime nemesis. I mean, friend of the pod. And
frenemy.
We absolutely love your show, and we love that we have a friendly, if not serious, rivalry. Although I would say you have a much larger team that could take us down in a street fight. We really just have Dave and I, and your panels.
And one guest at a time.
One guest at a time, usually. Occasionally. We have
sometimes two.
Right.
Your panels, do you want to... give us a history of how you got involved in the podcast, who's involved in it now, the panels, the whole thing?
Sure. So I actually didn't start the podcast. It was my former co-producer, Chris. He was in college and he wanted to do an independent study on Gravity's Rainbow, apparently because he read the book and he hated it. I'm not sure why then he wanted to do an independent study, but whatever. But he couldn't find any professors that would take that on. And so when he finished college, he just sort of put this idea out there of starting this podcast. And there's already sort of a communal group that does this Pynchon in Public, which is on the 8th of May every year, which is Pynchon's birthday. And the idea is just to take a picture of yourself out in public reading one of Pynchon's books. And, it's kind of get at this idea. Obviously, Pynchon is one of our most notoriously, I don't really want to call him reclusive, but he definitely does not like the public eye.
Sure, yeah.
So the idea was to sort of kind of play with that a little bit. And so, so Chris reached out to one of the guys involved in that, and they started doing the podcast. I got in on the second episode, and from there, it really... I mean, I don't want to say that I was like the reason that it really took off, but
Own it.
I had at
Own
least
it,
the
Bo.
technical know-how to make it a little better and to really sort of put it together. And then Chris and I worked together for many years. We've done 5 seasons. We're on the 5th season right now. And we always had sort of put out this call at the end of the show that if you wanted to be on the show, just email us. And over the years, we picked up a lot of different panelists. We've had panelists on from many different countries, and that's been really cool. I enjoy that a lot. And
Yeah, I like the Irish fellow that you had on for the End of the Gravity's Rainbow one.
yeah, Liam, he's been on the show since I think our 2nd, maybe 3rd season. I don't remember. He's
fun to listen to.
Yeah, he's fun to listen to, and he definitely does not have the Irish accent that we all think of when we think of an Irish accent. Yeah, and so we sort of hit a point where we had this particular group of panelists, and I told Chris, I think this is the group that we can tackle Gravity's Rainbow with. That was sort of like, the big thing. Like, were we ever going to get to that book? When, how, all that sort of stuff. And then even during that season, we picked up a couple of people who are still on. So right now, carrying into season 5, we're covering Bleeding Edge, which is Pynchon's last book, his most recent book, maybe is the better way to put it. There's myself, there's the aforementioned Liam, a guy named Alan, who we picked up in the Gravity's Rainbow season, who is sort of from the Philadelphia, New York City area. And then there's Og and Paola, who actually found us through Twitter. She and I kind of became friends, but she is Italian by birth, but she's lived in England for like 25 years or something like that. So I feel like we've got, and my friend Michelle and I can't, she's going to be so mad that I left her for last.
I'll re-edit this. Don't worry, Michelle.
Michelle and I actually went to undergrad together. And
cool.
When we started The Crying of Lot 49, it has a female protagonist. And at the time, the podcast was just a sausage fest. And I wanted to get a female voice on the show. So I reached out to Michelle, and she's been on the show ever since. So that's been, it's been nice.
And do you mind saying where you went to undergrad and where you are based in now?
I did my undergrad at Bowling Green State University, which is in Ohio. I majored in creative writing. And after I graduated, because obviously no one pays you to write creatively, at least not initially, I got a job at the library at Bowling Green State University, where I still work.
Wow.
Cool.
The place that I work is actually really cool. It is, it's a book depository, and it basically try to picture 10,000 square feet of books and journals, all kinds of stuff. It's awesome. I seriously love it every single day.
That's awesome. That sounds like a nice place to spend 40 hours a week.
Yeah, it sure is.
Surrounded by books. That's cool. Has anyone ever told you, Bo, that H. John Benjamin, the actor, sounds like you? Have you ever got that? Do you know who that is?
I don't. No one's told me that, but I also don't know who that is. Is it the guy who plays Booger in Revenge of the Nerds? Because
I don't think so.
No, I'm just joking around.
He's the voice of Archer on the cartoon Archer.
Oh, I sound like Archer.
He's also been on Human Giant and Bob's Burgers and The Simpsons. And he's kind of one of those actors that's like, he's not a household name or anything, but you see him around a lot and you're like, oh yeah, I recognize that guy. Like, he's on Master of None and some other kind of shows. Okay. Parks and Recreation, he's got a credit on if you look through his IMDb.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Anyways, every time I hear your show, I just like, you come on and I just picture that guy's face. That's why I wanted to get a video of you at the start of this, so I knew that I wasn't talking to that actor.
So, I don't know any of these shows, Dave, but I appreciate your context.
Parks and Recreation, I'm sure you've heard of.
I'm sure you know
Michael Schur's.
I've heard of it, but
one of the episodes has a lot of Infinite Jest references.
I completely flipped out when I was watching that episode. It like pans across this like nameplate of a law firm, and like after it panned across, I was like, wait a minute, and I paused it, and and like all 4 of those names were from Infinite Jest. I was completely losing it. I was like taking pictures of the TV you know, and then I was paying attention to every single name that comes, like they go into a medical building and it's the CT Tavis Medical Center. And like they meet with this like reproduction doctor and her name is Dr. Van Dyne. Like I was completely losing it. It was great.
That's awesome. So I think I've heard before, Bo, like through Twitter or something, that you've read Infinite Jest something like 6 times.
I have. It's not something
which is twice as much as I've read it. So you might be more qualified to host this show than I am at this point.
I mean, I appreciate it, but I have my own show, so thanks.
Oh yeah, you don't want to jump ship.
No, I don't.
I was thinking about starting a Jonathan Franzen podcast. You could jump over here.
You know what?
And then
I will run both podcasts just so I can run your Franzen podcast into the ground.
Into the ground, yeah, good.
Thank you.
Doing the literary world a friggin' service. Thanks, Bo.
Let me ask you though, the Pynchon in Public like Twitter feed. I feel like is run by a guy named John from London. Yes. Do you have any like intersection with that group, or like, what's the story there?
So him and Dr. Martin Eve, they're the guys who started this Pynchon in Public, not the podcast, but the sort of, I don't know what to call it. The cultural movement, let's call it that. They're the ones who started that. And so when Chris wanted to start a podcast, that was sort of where he started. So initially, the guy who runs the @Pynchon in Public, he was on some of the initial episodes. His name is actually Bill, and we had him on in a couple of early seasons. And that man loves Crying of Lot 49 like no one has ever loved a book before.
It's a great book.
But he actually stopped doing the podcast right when we started the Crying of Lot 49 season. So I'm not really sure. Maybe he just loves it too much to really dig that deeply into it. I don't really know, but that's the connection. Yeah.
Okay. Well, while we're at that, I mean, I'm curious for people who haven't listened to your show extensively. Give us a little bit.
I don't believe that there are people like that out there, but continue.
Okay. Let hypothetically, let's just say, if there were someone who did not know your own preferences of Pynchon's novels, can you give us a breakdown of where you land with Crying of Lot 49, Gravity's Rainbow, all the way up through Bleeding Edge?
Right. Well, like any responsible parent, I love all of my children the same. No, I think I'm a little bit of an anomaly in the Pynchon world because my favorite Pynchon novel is Against the Day.
Okay. That's good to know.
I prefer the world spanning novels much more than I like the sort of what they call the California novels. Mm-hmm. So my tops are going to be Against the Day, Gravity's Rainbow, and Mason and Dixon. And then I do like the other books quite a bit. I like Inherent Vice, I think, a lot more than some Pynchon fans do. I think they consider it Pynchon light. I hear that a lot, but I think it's a pretty solid book. And then maybe The Crying of Lot 49. And then honestly, after that, like, it's been a long time since I've read Vineland. We're doing Bleeding Edge right now. And I think I liked Bleeding Edge a little bit more before we started really digging into it this season.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm kind of waiting to see how I feel about that. And then, what have I missed? I missed something.
V.
V is the one book I haven't read.
Wow.
And I don't mean like the one book in all the world, obviously.
That would be amazing.
It would be. I had a Shakespeare teacher who, she told us one time that there were 3 Shakespeare plays that she hadn't read yet. And she was doing that on purpose so that at some point in her life, she would have some new Shakespeare to read. And this was somebody who'd been teaching Shakespeare for a decade or so and writing on Shakespeare and all this sort of stuff. And I thought that was really cool. So I've kind of purposefully saved V so that whenever we get to it, whenever we do a season on that particular book, I'll be the fresh eyes on it, which might be weird to also be the host and do that. We'll see how that works out. I'm not sure. But yeah, I have not read that one.
Well, it's interesting that you said that you made a difference between the kind of world building novels and the California ones, but yet you put Inherent Vice pretty high in your list. What explains that?
Well, for starters, the main character, Doc Sportello, is infinitely likable. I don't know, he's basically the dude from The Big Lebowski in a slightly different lens. But what I really like about that book is it does something that I think there's kind of two ideas going on in a broad sense in Pynchon's books. One is with these kind of longer world-spanning novels, of which I would actually count V. There's this kind of like idea of an alternate history of the United States, or maybe a history of the marginalized version of the United States, or the marginalized peoples of the United States. And then the quote-unquote California novels, I think that they're sort of the end point of that journey, of that alternate history. And so you get Vineland, which covers kind of the 80s, but also the 60s, because it does a lot of flashback stuff. And you get Crying Out Loud 49, which is also the 60s. And Inherent Vice takes place in like 1970, 1971. And you get the feeling reading that book that Pynchon himself considers that year and maybe even specifically two things that I'm just going to say these two names together and we can all decide for ourselves whether they're inextricably linked. Charles Manson and Richard Nixon.
Yep.
Yep. So it's almost like that year, 1970, and maybe those two people and the events around them are some sort of linchpin to him, from which his alternate history maybe conflates into what we sort of currently have, or maybe a better way to say it is where Bleeding Edge kind of ends up. I'm not really sure about where it goes, but for as fun as I think that book is, and I do enjoy the movie quite a bit as well, I think it's fun to read, and there is a lot of depth there, despite it being quote unquote Pynchon light. But I think there's a real pathos in that book, and a real sense of loss for an America that he had hoped would be, but is not. And I think that's the book where he really reveals that.
But see, to me, that's a criticism of Pynchon, in that he's sort of stuck in that world. And that in Inherent Vice and Bleeding Edge, he's always looking back to that world, which originally he wrote about, with Crying of Lot 49, and that, this world of popular music in the late 1960s, early 1970s, he's sort of stuck in that world of looking back to. And especially with Bleeding Edge, I felt like there was a lot of parts that felt very like out of touch with reality, or out of touch with the early 2000s and the internet culture that he was trying to write about. What did you think of that early bit?
I thought of that when I first read the book when it came out. I think the biggest shock to me was reading Thomas Pynchon use the word first-person shooter.
That's shocking.
It seems like a phrase that he should have coined or something.
That got to me more than like the Britney Spears reference that most people complain about. And I see where you're coming from, but having looked at the book again and really more in depth since we're looking at it this season, it honestly, I don't know that he is actually writing about internet culture. I think he's actually writing about the same things he always writes about, which are in these shorter novels, which are essentially real estate, entropy, and following the money. And the other stuff, like he just revels in popular stuff, music, TV shows, all this sort of thing. And so I think that's kind of what he uses to build his world a little bit. And I think in that particular novel, he is somewhat out of touch. And I think it's worth remembering a little bit, at least, that when he was writing that, he was probably in his late 60s, early 70s. And he's probably more in touch with the 2000s at that time than I will be with whatever year it is when I'm in my late 60s, early 70s. So I'm willing to cut him some slack there.
But what about, that idea of entropy, that's a pretty broad category. How do you see that working from, his first book all the way up to Bleeding Edge? Because I think you could make an argument that that's something he's always been interested in every book.
Yeah,
it is. Yeah, and actually it predates his first book. He has a short story in his collection, Slow Learner, and the short story itself is called Entropy, and that seems to be where his fascination with this really starts. And in the Crying of Lot 49, he actually brings in a Maxwell's demon, which is this whole thought experiment within the world of thermodynamics and all sorts of stuff. The idea of entropy, and I feel like after 6 years of dealing with this Pynchon podcast, I feel like I might understand entropy better than any non-science person ever. And I think
it's great.
Is it useful?
The leading humanities scholar on the second law of thermodynamics.
But I think entropy is essentially, I like to talk about entropy in terms of a Rubik's Cube. If you take a Rubik's Cube and you mess it all up, it has a low state of entropy. When you start to solve it, you're actually increasing the entropy of the Rubik's Cube. And when you're done, the Rubik's Cube is not itself an entropic system, really, because all 6 sides are different colors, but it has a high degree of entropy. We tend to equate entropy with chaos, and that's not really true. In fact, entropy is order. The more dissimilar things are, the less entropic they are. And so when you think about that in terms of literary themes, and especially Pynchon's themes, when you look at a land or an area that has not been developed at all, that has a very low entropy, once you start building streets, and once you start building those streets in nice little squares, and I always get the Weeds theme song stuck in my head right here.
Little boxes.
Yeah. And, and then you get people driving on those, and they all have very similar cars, and the people dress the same, and they have the same interests. That's a high degree of entropy. And I think that is essentially what Pynchon's writing and career is trying to go against. I think he's actively showing the danger of cultural entropy and highlighting the people who either have chosen not to be subsumed by that or otherwise have not been through usually some other paranoid means or whatever.
Yeah, totally. I was going to say, in terms of themes that run throughout all his work, paranoia is pretty high up there as well.
Yeah, it sure is.
That's fascinating what you're saying about entropy, as it relates to the United States or the political systems of the United States. Certainly that land as a sort of unproven state in Mason and Dixon is there.
Yeah.
How do you see his interest in the political systems? And what do you think of proving that out of where we are now?
Pynchon's a little bit weird because it seems like he would go into politics a lot more than he does. The only thing I can say about his politics for certain is that he has no love for Richard Nixon. Beyond
Fair
that,
enough.
Yeah, beyond that, I'm not really sure. I think maybe a way to look at it is that our sort of current climate, where we have 2 very polarized political parties, that in itself is highly entropic. Sure, there are 2 parties and they have very different views, but basically no one can get elected unless they share those views. There's not a whole lot of room for middle of the road in American politics anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly the warning that to the degree, I'm not sure that Pynchon would really step in and give us a warning, but if there is one politically in his books, I think that's the warning.
Well, that's interesting in that you said earlier your favorite book of his was Against the Day. And how do you see that fitting in with a kind of warning about, I don't know, American culture or politics?
Against the Day is interesting because it takes place between about 1893 and a little bit after World War I. And it concerns itself greatly with the advent of electricity. And, another way to look at electricity is light. And the characters in that book, especially the book starts out with this group called the Chums of Chance, and I just absolutely love them.
I love the Chums of Chance.
I would sign up in a heartbeat.
Even You're if an honorary Chum of Chance.
I would be.
I think I would join the Money Stealers Club. That'd be my first priority.
But they undergo, the characters of the Chums of Champs undergo a change somewhere, off the screen, if you will. And, there's a point where they stop being the sort of fun-loving adventure boys that we met, and they become somehow darker. And I don't always know what to make of that. Part of me wishes that we could have seen what happened. But then again, that's one of Pynchon's things is he'll write about things happening around these big events, but you never really see like in Gravity's Rainbow, we never really see World War II at all.
Right. Yeah.
And so on the other, so in that sense, it makes sense there. Now, what is he doing what's his warning there in that particular book politically? I'm not really sure. He goes in quite a bit about money and one of the big Pynchon bad guys, Scarsdale vibe, is obviously the sort of the character we're supposed to be really, really warned about. But I don't know that the book really deals with politics all that much. The closest thing is, the other thing that the book about is this long drawn out revenge story. And I'm also a sucker for any revenge story.
Big Tarantino fan then?
I am and I'm not. I like his stories.
Yeah, sure.
I wish. Well, I don't want to get into we're not on the Tarantino podcast. But yeah, in general, I really so this revenge story is really about. It's actually the sort of sub story about like unions versus the non-unionized and the idea of anarchy versus non-anarchy, which probably isn't really a term. And that probably that's probably a pretty close analog for politics there, because in that particular book, the unions are also employing people who are doing very illegal things. They're employing people to kill people who are against the unions and things like that. And I think that's a pretty solid analog for how a lot of governments have been run and sometimes still are run. So I don't know. I feel like I said a whole lot without really answering your question.
No. I think that, it just like any other Pynchon book, it leads me to another question. Sure. Which is, at what point did you read Wallace, and what was the first David Foster Wallace work that you read?
Well, the first David Foster Wallace book I read was actually Infinite Jest.
That's a good choice.
Well, I had two friends, and I had only two friends, by the way. I never had more than two friends. These two friends, amongst the many friends that I have, I think it was on Facebook or something. No, it couldn't have been, because it was like 2006. But they challenged each other to read Infinite Jest and to see who finished it first. And so I was like, whatever, I'll be in on that. And I vaguely knew the name David Foster Wallace, but I knew nothing about this book. So I requested it, from the library where I work. And then one day I walked by the shelf where my books was, and I saw this huge fat book on the shelf, and I was like, what did I order?
Oh, damn it.
Right. And I had no idea. And so I started it. I got about 100 pages into it, had no idea what was going on, and stopped reading the book. I didn't hate it. I just had no clue what was going on.
Yeah.
In 2008, I decided I was going to read all of the hard books on my shelves that I had been putting off. So like in 1 year, I read like Atlas Shrugged and Gravity's Rainbow and like House of Leaves. I read like 10 books that year total, right? And I somewhere at the beginning of the summer, I picked up Infinite Jest, and I fell in love with it. Really, it took me until I got to the section on Kate Gompert, and that's what really sold me on the book.
Wow.
Wow,
we don't hear that often, because that's fairly early on in the book. I think, in the first 100 pages, maybe.
It is.
I
I just said that I read like 100 pages. I had to have read way less than that, because I've got it open to this section right now, and it's on page like 70 or something like that.
Yeah.
So
it's fairly early on. I mean, I compare that when other people try to read the book and say, "Oh, I couldn't get into it." I say, "How far did you go?" And to me, if they don't make it to Eschaton, which is like page 320 something,
yeah.
That to me is like, if you have a 300-page book, you got to give it at least, I don't know, 90 pages in.
yeah,
Right.
And
So you got to scale that proportionally.
Yeah, that's like 90 pages for Infinite Jest is like Eschaton. If you're not hooked by then, you're probably not gonna be.
right. And I can agree with that. And so I got to that section, and I was absolutely hooked. And it's the thing that I feel like a lot of people don't want to talk about, with understandable reasons. But I knew from reading that he got depression better than anyone who's trying to talk about depression in the literary world right now. And it just so happened that obviously that was the year that he died. And it also just so happened that he killed himself on my birthday.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, obviously I don't take that personally, right? But it was...
Yeah, I'm sure those things aren't linked.
No, not at all.
Pynchon's paranoia might have you think otherwise.
I'm sure it does. Yeah, there's no getting away from that. But yeah, so, I'd started reading the book, and I was really hooked on it. And really what hooked me was this business with depression. And I don't know how much people realize this, there's a lot of suicide in this book. A lot.
Yep.
I think there's like the number of characters who are left-handed is slightly more than the number of people who eliminate their own maps, right? And I kept noticing it. And I was like, wow, this is a guy who, and I knew nothing about Wallace. This is a guy who I really hope has gotten some help. And then on my birthday, a friend of mine texts me and says, there's some news about David Foster Wallace. And I didn't even have to read the news. I knew what it was just from reading this book.
It's funny because I didn't know. Like, I got a ton of people texting me that night, and I didn't know. And like, I just thought he was a really good writer. And, he went to extreme lengths to sort of lie about AA, which is supposed to be anonymous.
Right.
And he went to extreme lengths to sort of downplay his own personal history as it related to his writing. And I actually thought he was extremely well adjusted, and that he was a tenured professor who had gotten a good job and moved across the country to California. And so to me, the ability for him to write about depression or mental illness was just indicative of his ability to write about anything very well.
There's something...
And it's only in retrospect that I think you're correct, that it's like, no, that's actually quite unique.
There's something that Kate Gompert says. I want to read it because this is what got me. The last thing more I'd want is hurt. I just didn't want to feel this way anymore. I didn't believe this feeling would ever go away. I don't. I still don't. I'd rather feel nothing than this. And that was when I knew that this was somebody who struggled with depression and suicide. A lot of people don't understand that component. That, I mean, and Kate Gomper says there are plenty of people who try to commit suicide because they want to hurt themselves, but there are people who just want to stop feeling whatever it is that they're feeling. And I knew that he got it. And I didn't, and again, at the time of his death, I very much believe that the book and the author are completely separate people, or separate entities. I try not to let knowledge of the author influence how I read a book. So I'm in the middle of this book. I did not look anything up about him whatsoever. So I didn't know that he was a tenured professor, all this sort of stuff. I might have had the same reaction as you at that point, but I knew that at least when he was writing this book, he had gone through some shit. I knew that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's really interesting to me, in that, you expect a fiction writer to be able to project themselves into a fictional world and to write about something that is outside of their experience.
Yeah, but that old dictum, write what you know. I mean, the truth is that I think the maybe a better way to put that is, you know what you write. And I think it is kind of a fiction writer's job to sell you on knowing these things that you don't know. And he's good at that too. Like that whole business in The Pale King about getting a new social security number when you start working for the IRS. Like I was totally sold on that. I was like, I was putting that up as like a trivia question for students who work for me and things. Like he totally got me on that one. And he is good at that. But he's also really good at trying to hide himself by putting himself into his fiction in ways that you're not going to pick up on or are very, very obscure. Which, even saying that out loud, makes me realize that is such a Wallace thing to do. It really is.
Right.
To put yourself out there but hide at the same time, and there's, I mean,
that's like the mail fraud conundrum in that class, right? Like,
right.
How does the kleptomaniac, who's also agoraphobic, fulfill both of their tendencies? And then one of the kids writes mail fraud. Yeah.
Yeah, and he, I don't know, that just seemed to be his stock in trade, and I just felt like he had attended AA meetings, either for real or for research, and I'm still not really sure which is the truth there. But I knew from reading,
for real.
Okay, I knew from reading that he had dealt with depression, and then after I read this book, is it in? I think it's in Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. He has that whole story on the depressed person.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Like that story also is very, very, very true.
It's a deep dive.
I gotta say, when that story first came out, I couldn't read it.
Yeah, I don't like it very much.
Like I couldn't read it. Like it was actually painful to read, and I was like, why would anyone want? It was one of the few things where I had read where I felt like I understood why someone would need to write this, but not why someone would need to read this.
Yeah, like the narrator's so unlikable that you just like loathe them the entire time you're reading it.
Right.
Very painful.
Yeah.
It is, but to me, and I don't really like the story, and it is very hard to read. But to me, the depth of that story is the part where the narrator consistently refers to herself as the depressed person.
Yeah,
that sort of like disassociation of self with this category of being is so sad to me, and that to me, that's where the story lands.
Well, and then it came out later that story was written, about Elizabeth Wurtzel, or his, girlfriend.
Right.
And that was sort of hurtful, and that,
sure,
if it's mocking someone or making fun of someone, like I just didn't buy that. Like I don't think you could write a story that long and extensive without feeling it yourself.
Agreed.
I mean, it was very much a cop-out to say, oh, the depressed person is someone else. It's like, that has to be you. That has to be some lived experience in some way.
The voice is so embodied that it would be hard to,
And again, that's Wallace's stock in trade, to put himself out there but hide behind something. That's what he does.
But if you could back up for just a second,
Sure.
I'm not clear on your own timeline about like, what is your own sort of background? What is your reading history? Give us like, the thing that made you want to be a reader, and like, what did you discover first, et cetera, et cetera.
I don't really know what made me want to be a reader. I just know I've always read books. I honestly, even going back to when I was a kid, like one of my former bosses, she was telling me she didn't really read all that much until she was out of college. And I was like, what's wrong with you? Like that thing that Hal says, like, I do things like get in a taxi and say to the library and step on it. Like where I grew up, there weren't taxis, but like my parents literally used a trip to the library as incentive to get me to do my chores when I was a kid. I've always read. I have always gravitated to the fattest book on the shelf. The first sort of like grown-up book that I read was Stephen King's It. I was in like sixth grade, and that probably was too young to read that book.
Where were your parents, Bo?
My parents, you know what? Everybody's parents has their faults. And the one thing I will never fault my parents on is that they never stopped me from reading anything, ever.
Yeah. That's like that in your episode, the final episode, where you guys were talking about Gravity's Rainbow. You're talking about the Pulitzer Prize not being awarded that year in 1974, I think. The obscenity of the book, was too much for the committee, especially the stuff with was it Sergeant Butters or Colonel Butters?
Brigadier Pudding, but
Pudding. Yeah, what I think about it. Yeah,
you're close.
So a pretty apt name for the scene, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the idea of like, this is too obscene for kids to read. Well, where are their parents? That was a funny comment. But if your kid's reading Gravity's Rainbow, like, congrats,
Yeah.
I have a sixth grader child living in my home, and my son this year wanted to buy Stephen King's It. And I bought it for him.
Good.
And I was like, knock yourself out. You want to go read whatever you want to read, I will gladly encourage it. And it's like, whatever faults my parents had, they did not prohibit me from reading anything on my dad's shelf. And, I remember my dad had a lot of Lawrence Sanders books. I don't know if either of you have read Lawrence Sanders, but I absolutely love him to this day. He was a crime writer, mystery writer that you could get from like Book of the Month Club, but he was phenomenal. And, my dad absolutely loved these books, and he had a bunch of like the first deadly sin, the second deadly sin, the third deadly sin, the fourth deadly sin, the fifth deadly sin, the sixth deadly sin. And I was like,
when's it going to end, Matt?
I was like, I actually want to know what every deadly sin is. But he didn't, if I was picking up a book, he would not tell me, oh, that's inappropriate. He would let me read whatever. So I think that's a great entry point to being a lifelong reader. I mean, times have obviously changed now, and that there's a lot more of like graphic novels available than there were when we were kids.
True. And honestly, like some of the young adult literature out there now deals with things that are way heavier than the young adult stuff that existed when I was a kid. Like I think about like John Green's stuff. Like he's really diving into some pretty deep things. Like in the one book, the two main characters have cancer. In his most recent book, he's dealing with, OCD. Like when I was a kid, I was reading like Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators. Like, and I love those books. I still love those books, but like they didn't have real problems.
But I guess also like books like Lord of the Flies and 1984 and Brave New World, and The Great Gatsby, kind of like standard American, canonized, literature that kids read in high school. I guess there's like some of that stuff is heavy as well, but in a different kind of way, I guess. Like,
right.
Yeah.
And those books are also like they're presented differently. Like they're not when you're giving them in school, they're not presented as young adult literature. Like here are some books that you're probably going to hate, but we're going to test you on them. You know?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's true.
Well, and that point about, you know, that they don't really have adult concerns in some way, it reminds me of a few things that I really loved, which were Trixie Belden books. I absolutely loved this character called Trixie Belden, who apparently didn't even have to go to school. She didn't do anything except for solve mysteries.
What a life.
And it was like, that's sort of like Scooby-Doo, right?
Yeah.
Just solve mysteries. I don't know, travel around, have adventures. But there was also like some adult novels that I discovered later in life where I felt like I read the book and realized the characters didn't really have a job or to have to worry about anything beyond their immediate story.
Yeah.
And a great example of that is Iris Murdoch, A Severed Head, which if no one's ever read that book, you absolutely should. It's a phenomenal book. But after I read the book, I was like, yeah, these are really rich people who don't have a lot of concerns outside of like, you know, relationships, period.
Isn't that just how it is for rich people?
I mean, I would hope so.
Yeah.
I would hope so.
I really have
what
no
about
idea.
More money, more problems, though.
And it's, I don't want to get into it, but like, it actually brings up a good question is that like, to me, every time, like when Bleeding Edge came out, all I could think about was like, there's this guy, Thomas Pynchon, somewhere in New York, just like writing these stories. Like, what is he actually worried about? What does he care about? You know, what did you think when that book came out? I guess 2009? Is that right?
2013.
Oh, wow. I'm way off. 2013.
So I read it right when it came out, and I didn't pick up on this initially, but covering it now, I think I understand what that book is really about. He has lived in New York for a good part of his life to this point, and this book is really a love letter to the Big Apple. That's what he's doing with this book, and he's doing that also at a time of obviously massive transition in all kinds of ways. You know, forget about 9/11 for a minute, but this is also just after the .com bubble burst. This is right at the beginning of, you know, I mean, the internet existed in 2000, 2001, but it wasn't what it is today. We wouldn't be able to record any of this on the internet of 2000, 2001, right?
Nope.
So yeah.
We can barely do it now, right, Skype?
Hey, all right, it's like when you go to a restaurant, you don't piss off the cook until you get your food. You don't piss off Skype until you finish the recording.
Oh, God.
That's kind of a rule that we have on our show.
That's good.
So yeah, I think that's honestly what this book is about. I think in a way like 9/11 happened, and not really, I don't think it's the event itself. I mean, I'm sure that affected him a great deal, but everything that's happened since, the fallout, politically, culturally, all kinds of things, I think that affected him very deeply. And he sort of then looked back on the city that he very much loves and has a lot of affection for, and wanted to talk about this event that changed not only the city, but everything, really the world beyond it. And I think that's really what he's doing with this book.
Well, and does that make you think, like, you know, how many books does he have left, right? Is it 80 years old? How was it, 81, 82?
Yeah.
Are him and DeLillo the same age? He must be within a year or two.
Yeah, they've got to be close. I honestly don't expect another Thomas Pynchon book. I expect maybe one after he dies. So, you know, that's been like sitting in a closet somewhere. I don't think we'll see the like collections that we saw come out after Wallace died. I do actually think that Bleeding Edge might be the last thing that we hear from him. I don't like that idea, but at the same time, I'm a little bit glad to know that at some point our podcast will end. Unlike
Ours
your
never
podcast,
will.
you're going to keep
never will.
digging up people forever. And that's
we have a bit of a difference of format, I guess, in that way that you guys do a deep dive into a book, and it's kind of like a book club, fly on the wall type thing.
Yeah, we call ourselves the world's most sadistic book club.
That might be true, actually.
Yeah. So I don't really expect to see another book. At the same time, I literally have notes at the ready so that we can record an episode on the fly when we hear of his passing.
Wow. I mean, obviously we did not have that with Wallace.
Right.
And it was very shocking to hear of his death at the time. And do you know, what is the sort of lowdown on, like, what his writing has been over the past 10 years or so? I mean, I haven't really been in touch with, like, are you on the Pynchon email list at all? Like, what is the chatter on there? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not on a Pynchon email list. I'm never really sure sometimes how academically oriented these lists are. And perhaps this is appropriate for the guy running a Pynchon podcast, but I'm suspicious of academia. So I kind of stay away from things that I think might be in that vein.
Fair enough. I mean, I think that's fair enough. I will tell you that, my experience with the Wallace email list is that it is a direct spin-off of the Pynchon email list.
Boy.
They're like, all right, get your own list, guys.
It's like symbolic somehow or metaphorical in some way that I can't quite put my finger on. Interesting.
Well, it is, in that, I have a pretty well-documented theory that I have not completely published yet, that whenever the internet was first really born with ARPANET in the 1970s, it sort of coincided with the rise of Gravity's Rainbow and the publication of Gravity's Rainbow, and that the internet was sort of invented to talk about books, movies, music, these sorts of things, and that the first real book discussed on the internet was Gravity's Rainbow.
I obviously like that theory quite a bit. The only thing I would add to it is that I think the internet was also invented to exchange pornography.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah. And the scientists who invented it, I think that they first had opinions about movies, and they, second of all, wanted to share dirty pictures. And then third, they also wanted to talk about Star Trek. And there's a lot of talk about Star Trek in the 1970s internet. But there's also, like, the same scientists, who are all PhDs who are putting these nodes of ARPANET together were talking about Gravity's Rainbow. And, that's the type of book that took a couple of years to digest. And I think that that's part of the reason why it didn't, immediately gain upon publication the sort of success that some other books did.
I wouldn't disagree with that. And I think you can say basically the same thing about Infinite Jest.
Yes. Oh, and right now I feel this same sense of disregard with Knausgaard books, and that book 6 just came out, and it's like a huge book, and there's no way a book reviewer can give it proper credit in whatever kind of deadline that they've got. Like, it's like 1,200 page novel. And it just makes a reviewer's life hell.
Right.
So, have you finished it yet, Matt?
No. And I'm in no rush to finish it, because once I finish that one, that's it for Knausgaard.
Oh, is it the last one?
Okay.
So, I mean, in 1974, you did have a number of scientists who were able to send email. So, I mean, I don't know how old you guys are. I'm just going to pretend like we're all the same age. But like,
you know how old I am, Matt Booker.
I sent, my first email in about 1989, 1990. And that was over a dial-up modem with a BBS. And, at that point, there were 10 years, 20 years ahead of me of people who were having, dial-up modems and communicating via specific phone numbers or on, news groups that I had no sense of. And I really think that the first book that they seriously discussed, the way that we discuss Infinite Jest, they were discussing in a very primitive form in 1974, 1975, 1976. What's Gravity's Rainbow?
I wish I'd have heard this theory before we started the Gravity's Rainbow season. I maybe would try to go back through the Wayback Machine and dig those up, see what they were saying.
I'll send you my documentation later. I have some citations on this.
Okay,
it's not just total bullshit, but there's several Wallace scholars, as you can imagine, who are also Pynchon scholars. And there's a lot of overlap here with this group of people that we've talked about, one of whom is our buddy Jeff Severs. Jeff Severs, absolutely. And, he's written a lot about the sort of development of Pynchon studies. So like you said earlier, you're not an academic and yet you work at a university. So do you want to speak to that a little bit more and just explain like how that works out?
It's not that I don't value academia. I do. And I value education. I value higher education. And if you want to go learn something, go learn something. I'm absolutely for it. My problem with academia when it comes to literature studies and maybe the humanities in general is that I feel like it has essentially become, at best, a symbiote of the publishing industry, but I really think it's more like a parasite of the publishing industry. And I took some I took some classes at the graduate level, and I very quickly realized that basically becoming a professor meant writing papers, publishing papers, writing books, publishing books. And I respect the people who do that. It's nothing against that. But I don't feel like the purpose of academia should be that the professors within it are there to serve the publishing industry. I don't really give two shits if companies like Elsevier survive. I work for a library, and I wish EBSCO would go away. They provide a lot of really, really great content, but on the other side of that, all those databases that you're getting access to, all these articles, you have no idea the stuff that EBSCO is not giving you. You don't even see how they are preferencing their own stuff over other articles. And I see this stuff because I work at a library. I know what's going on in these deals. And it's all about making sure that these publishers get paid. And I feel like to a large degree, that's what academia is. So I'm a little, maybe not, but also let me throw out the usual caveat here. I'm a Pynchon fan, and I'm given to paranoia and conspiracy theories. So there's that.
Well, no doubt. And in fact, I used to work for Elsevier, so throw them on the garbage heap of history. That's fine. I'm also interested in like what other, there are a lot of other writers that get looped in with Pynchon, and like one reason why I think the Wallace list sprung up is that Pynchon was only coming out with a book every 10 years or so, and in that 10-year gap there was a lot of interest of like, well, what other writers are kind of like him,
right.
Who's the heir to the throne, and like Wallace was in that conversation, and so there would be a lot of discussion about like, what's this book about? Is this book the real deal? And there's still that that sort of question of like, who's the heir to the throne, right? Of Pynchon. And like, I'm curious what you think of, some of the other people who have been compared to him.
Yeah, I think Wallace had a pretty decent shot, especially once he realized that being a writer wasn't about showing the reader that he's smarter than the reader is. He got over that after Girl with Curious Hair, and that's great. And I think he had a really, really decent shot. Beyond that, but the other thing is that Wallace, he took, whether he wants to admit it or not, he took some of the things that Pynchon worked with, and I still don't really understand how he did it, but he took a lot of these same big ideas and he imbued them with a lot of empathy, and I don't get it entirely. One of Pynchon's biggest criticisms is that his characters feel flat, and I'm back and forth on that one. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I will say that I don't know that I feel like the author has a lot of sympathy for his characters here and there. Now, it's not like Franzen, who has outright hatred for most of his characters. But I don't know that he really feels for them. But I feel that Wallace did. And so what I'm interested in are some of the readers and people always cite, but I think Dave Eggers is a really good example of someone who picked up on that part of it. What I really want to see is someone pick up on the whole thing. Personally, I want that sort of, I call it high literary what the fuckness. Like, that's how I describe Pynchon, basically.
Yeah, that's good.
I want to see that combined with that deep empathy, and I haven't really seen that since Wallace. Now, that being said, I don't know that I read a lot of very new stuff. In one of your more recent episodes, somebody mentioned A Tale for the Time Being. And I picked that up. I'm about
Ruth Ozeki.
Yeah, Ruth Ozeki, and
I just picked that up too. I haven't started yet though.
Yeah, I'm about a quarter of the way through it. It's pretty good. I'm curious to see where it goes.
Yeah,
but I feel like that book has a lot of potential, and I feel like she's got a lot of other books out there, so we'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
Well, I just think it's interesting that the people who are interested in these authors, often it turns out what they're interested in are a series of traits or qualities or things they admire about the writer that do translate to other writers. And earlier on, like you mentioned, House of Leaves, and people who have read Pynchon have often read like Richard Farina, and people who have read Wallace have often read, other writers that, it might be Mark Lehner, it might be Franzen, it might be Costello, whoever they sort of get recommended, oh, you like this rather than that. And, I'm curious what you think about, how that's evolved in your own reading. Like, what did you come to first, or what kind of traits did you look for?
I realized some time ago that the thing that I look for the most is, I think, it's often called like maximalism, but I don't really care if every detail doesn't lead me somewhere. I'm really not interested in like I love obviously beautiful language, and Wallace is great at that, and he's so good at this beautiful language right next to this slang and all. I don't know how he does that either. But I am not interested in like every little thing coming to some nice little tidy conclusion. I'm not interested in like everything that's mentioned is mentioned for a reason. I'm okay with just ridiculous levels of detail that are absolutely meaningless or at least pointless. And so like that has those two things, language and just give me lots of stuff. That's what I'm interested in most, and I've noticed that I at least that second part I do that in like I play a lot of video games. That's kind of my thing because video games, in my opinion, are better for your brain than television. But
I thought you were going to say books.
no. I'll never say that. But I like video games that are just absolutely huge and just let me explore. I love a novel that is so big that you have no choice but to take it at your own pace.
Right.
You know.
So would you compare like Gravity's Rainbow with something like the games in the Fallout series where you're just kind of like wandering this expansive, post-apocalyptic kind of wasteland, and I can't trust anything or anybody, or
And there's another game. It's called Witness, or maybe The Witness. And
The Witness.
What I like about that game is it does not give you any instructions whatsoever. You know, you have no idea. You're just on this place. You have to solve these puzzles. You have no idea why. You have no idea if this is going anywhere. And that's how Gravity's Rainbow feels.
Yeah, it does.
And that's how, at least, let's say, maybe the first 200 pages of Infinite Jest feels too. You're getting these bits of information from obviously very different characters. You know nothing about them. Some of them are written in dialectically and badly at that. But you just thrown all this stuff, and the thing about Infinite Jest is you're getting these years, like you have no idea what Year of Glad means.
Yeah,
you know, are we talking about the trash bag company, or is everyone just happy that year? Like, what does that even mean? And so that, you know, it feels that way too, where he's just throwing all this stuff to you, and you've got to have a little bit of faith in the author and in the book to say, at some point, this is going to coalesce in my head, if nowhere else. And that's always like maybe I shouldn't admit this, I don't know, but like I've never finished Joyce's Ulysses.
I've never even tried to start Joyce's Ulysses. So you're in better shape than I am.
There's some things in it some passages in it that are absolutely beautiful, but that book fails to coalesce in my head at all. Like I know what it's about, and I know what happens and all that stuff, but all these things and all these different styles never come together in any way. And you nailed it earlier. Like to me, Infinite Jest comes together with the Eshkatan section. Like that's what makes that book. And I agree with you. If you don't at least get to there, you didn't really give the book a try. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and that sort of open world, rambling, and DeLillo has Underworld. Yeah. I'm thinking of like William T. Vollmann, who has a lot of really fat novels, and there's Gaddis and Gas and all of these. Anyone who can sort of construct their own world and sort of build a world that you can, I don't know, skip around in a bit.
Yeah.
And there are people who read Infinite Jest and don't read the endnotes. And I think that they're missing out, but they're playing in a way like I would compare almost to like a video game that you're comparing, like an open world game where they're choosing a sort of limitation that's available to them.
Right.
And it's like fair enough. There are limitations that you can impose upon yourself.
Right.
And a lot of other reading experiences don't offer that. They're just so linear that you have to read like this happens, then this happens. And, I think that's part of what appealed to people who had read Pynchon and then picked up Infinite Jest. Have you read at all of The Pale King?
Yeah, I've read that a couple times.
Okay, yeah. So I think The Pale King has a similar kind of non-linearity to it.
Well, it sure does.
That appeals to people who like, fragmentation of reality or something, where I would say, you can sort of dip in and dip out of it or find a chunk that relates to you. And that honestly, like not all of, Pynchon or Wallace is genius to me. That there's bits of it that are hit or miss.
Sure.
And some of it like relates to me extensively well. Like you brought up with Wallace, the depression stuff. He does that very well. And on our last episode, I think we talked about some stuff he doesn't do well. So I think you're right on. I'm also just like, while we have you, like, talk about some other books, man. Like, I was super curious about like Mason and Dixon. Like, I go back to that book a lot.
I've never read that one.
It's fantastic, but it's written in a sort of obsolete vernacular.
Right? Yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah, and he capitalizes all the nouns like they did back then and things like that.
Oh, okay.
And it's one of those things that when it's like if you come across a good story or a good book that's written in second person, like at first that's all you can notice, but if it's good, you stop noticing that. And that, Mason and Dixon does that. I've only read Mason and Dixon once. I can't really talk about it all that well. I know, and reading Pynchon, a lot of times you finish the book and you're like, wow, that was good, or wow, that was mediocre, or whatever. But what just happened? And there's like two little details that you always remember. And the only things I recall from Mason and Dixon with any real sense are the learned English dog and this like group of Native Americans who show up doing the sign that Spock always does, and they say live long and prosper. Like, that's really, of everything that happened in that book, that's what I remember. So I honestly can't talk about that book all that much. I'm looking forward to whenever we get to that in the podcast, so that I could re-experience the book.
Well, I'm just throwing it out really as an example of something that is extensive and it's complex and it sort of exists in its own little world. And that, if you do relate to it and if it does make sense to you, it's more than just like a weekend of reading. Like it's like months or a year of trying to process. And like, your podcast is kind of that way.
Yeah. I was about to say, it takes a long time to process, and then sometimes you create a podcast so that you can keep doing that.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and there's a handful of books that I really love. I love them. I have the physical copies, I have digital copies, and I have audio copies so that I can have these books with me all the time. And they are The Odyssey, Infinite Jest, Against the Day, and Gravity's Rainbow.
Wow.
And I have those books with me all the time. And I like, and the guy who reads Against the Day is astounding. He reads it so well. His name is Dick Hill, and I've always said that, like, if I go into audiobook production, my name's going to be Cock Knoll. But I mean, I'm kind of picking on his name, but he is so good. And I like that book. I'm just like, I almost constantly have that on a loop, even though the loop takes like a year to get through, whatever.
Right.
And there are just things. There are things that I think about literally every single day that I got from a book. Like Tom Robbins. I'm a big fan of Tom Robbins because his books are insane.
He's fun.
And,
they are.
And like the first time I saw one of his books, it was Fierce Invalids Home from Hot Climates. And I was like, who makes that the title of a book? Like that's just not a thing. And that's the whole reason I picked up that book. Right. And I've read all of his books, most of them repeatedly. And there's just, sorry. You get to have My Neighbor's Dog on your podcast now too.
You're fine.
We've had dump trucks. We've had helicopters.
Oh, I know. We've had so many.
Dogs welcome.
Yeah. And so like, Tom Robbins I read a lot of. I read a lot of Jack Kerouac, especially like I like On the Road pretty well, but the books that come after that, especially like Desolation Angels, I think is really good. Tristessa is really, really good. Also, like I had a girlfriend one time who told me that, I should say she accused me of only liking stuff that sucks. And by that she really meant stuff that's sad. And for some reason, like I'm drawn to things that are sad as opposed to things that are happy.
This is everyone I've ever known has accused me of this. So keep going.
So we're despite our podcast feud, we're going to get along just fine.
I had a group of students tell me once, I framed the English 11 course as like, Wallace's McCaffrey interview where he talks about good literature, it's 51% pain, 49% pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the course, they accused me that the course was like 99% pain and 1% pleasure of the stuff that we read.
Then you did a good job.
Then I did a good job.
You did.
I'll take it.
You did.
Thanks, Bo.
There's a lot of, I also like a lot of the, like the old class, like old epic literature. Like I mentioned, the Odyssey. I love Beowulf. I think Beowulf is amazing. And again, like these are, and that's just the thing with me. I just really like these big, expansive things that leave no stone unturned. That seems to be what I'm interested in. Now, as I mentioned, I did my undergrad in creative writing. It's not such a good thing for a person who wants to write, because then you just never stop writing, but whatever. We can move past that. So
have you read the Mystery.doc?
I have not.
Matthew McIntosh. I just finished that last month. You'd probably really dig it. It's a fast read. Like it's a 1,600 page book, but a lot of the page space is like photos or just white page. Like it's a very quick read. But you'd probably dig it for a lot of those reasons.
All right.
Mentioned.
I'll make a note of that.
Oh God. I mean,
rabbit hole on that, or
oh God. I mean, isn't this the curse of liking long novels? Is someone's always like, have you read this other one that you haven't read? It's like, nope. Nope. I haven't read it.
Well, try working at a library where you're literally seeing these things come and go every day. And, like I pick up a book and it almost breaks my wrist and I'm like, I have to check this out. So, yeah.
I'm fine with that. I mean, I actually worked at a library when I was about 16, but it was by force of law.
And did you get served with a misdemeanor, Matt?
I got sentenced in teen court.
Right.
Really?
And I was allowed to choose a speeding ticket.
Okay.
And I was allowed to choose my punishment. Alexa, stop. Jesus Christ.
Is that another dog?
That was Alexa. That was my speaker. Gonna start playing now.
I like that you were saying I was allowed to choose my punishment, and then Alexa.
Anyways,
started
I was allowed to choose my punishment, and there was not robotic listening devices throughout the home at the time. But
that's Pynchonian.
I chose the library because I love the library, but my friend chose the municipal airport, and as like a sky cap, and he got tons of like tips, which you were not supposed to get during court as a volunteer, because he was just like helping with baggage, and he made like $60, whereas like I had to get up at the butt crack of dawn and go and like vacuum the millions of rows of stacks.
Right. We don't get tips
just
either.
Sucked. No, there was no tips to be had. So like I actually regretted my experience of working in a library because there was no tips. But
honestly, like there's all kinds of different librarians, but to me, whenever somebody comes in and they want reading recommendations, I live for that. I geek out so quickly when that happens, like way more than I do when I go in like the Lego store or something. Like it's unbelievable.
Do you ask them how much time they have when they ask for recommendations?
No, I usually start with like tell me the last 5 things that you read and enjoyed.
Yeah, okay, that's good.
Whether they were for class or not, and then I kind of go from there. Or like when somebody came in one time and they had to do a project on like Emily Dickinson and wanted to know like which edition that they should look at, and I was like, well, this edition, the publisher went through and like changed her punctuation and then removed some of it, so maybe that's not what you want, and like that really is what I live for. I love that stuff. It doesn't happen all that often, but I love it. And then of course, anytime somebody asks for something to read, I'm like, well, there's this guy named Thomas Pynchon. Let me show you that section. That's the reward, honestly.
Uh-huh.
And I
trying
gotta
to
say,
take down Elsevier.
Can we? Oh, fuck that. Can we just go back to the Emily Dickinson, please? Because I absolutely love Emily Dickinson, and just bought an edition of her complete poems.
Nice.
Over the Thanksgiving break, and have a edition of her letters, and I think that she explains humanity and suffering and mental illness maybe in a way that no one else ever has or ever will.
Yeah.
So like you bringing her up now, probably just coincidental, but like to me, that's a phenomenal reference. And that if people who are listening to this don't own sort of the complete works of Emily Dickinson, they need to just go through and just like plow through all of that, because I think it's super important.
I agree. She somehow gets it in a way, like you're saying, that maybe no one else has. I don't really know, but yeah, I have a lot of love for her too.
Well, and she basically like lived in a closet like for like dozens of years, and it's really bizarre human experience.
Right.
But like, let's do a whole nother show that, you know, I'll be happy to read through a few of my favorites of Emily Dickinson, and we can deconstruct them.
That sounds great.
I love that. Yeah.
I actually like to contrast her with Walt Whitman, who
another one of my all-time favorites.
Yeah, but I find him interesting because he seems to have that sort of that depth that Dickinson has, but he's also much more positive. And I find that very curious, you know, because he was gay. Mm-hmm. And so he had his own sort of situation there, but then he's also living at that time and he's male. So to what degree does he get to have that exuberance where she's not allowed to have it because she's the kind of mad woman in the attic, you know?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think some of it is like their disposition was she was naturally more depressive,
melancholic.
Yeah. And he was naturally more of like celebratory or engaged with the world.
Yeah, he sure used a lot of exclamation points.
He loved nude sunbathing as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, who doesn't?
Who doesn't?
Right.
But Emily Dickinson, I don't think did. I don't think she's a fan.
That's probably a safe assumption.
Probably not. So, I mean, this is extremely fun for me because mostly on this, you know, we talk about this. Wallace published like 10 books in his life. Mm-hmm. And we talk about those a lot. And I actually think, you know, with Infinite Jest, that was enough. And like there was a big, you know, when he died in 2008, there came out this D.T. Max story in 2009.
Yeah.
Do you remember this story, the New Yorker essay?
Yeah, I read the New Yorker essay, and then he also kind of parlayed that into his biography, right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Yeah.
But, you know, there was a part of that narrative was like Wallace's ability to top Infinite Jest or like do better than Infinite Jest. And I sort of wonder about that with Pynchon a lot. You know, did he feel the need to outdo himself or do better? And I sort of felt like that with when Against the Day came out. I was like, wow, this is like Gravity's Rainbow, you know, 1.5
but
or
with hot air
2.5
balloons
or
instead of
something.
V2s.
I mean, kind of.
Yeah, and that's how I feel about it. But a lot of people and a lot of the criticism out there definitely couches Against the Day as a lesser version of Gravity's Rainbow. And I disagree with that. And whenever we get around to it, I'm definitely going to take that, you know, I'm going to take some of these critics to task. Absolutely. I do actually think that Wallace did top Infinite Jest in his short stories. Some of his short stories, I think because of their very efficiency, are absolutely brilliant. Like, I think Octet is one of the most amazing short stories I've ever read in my life. And I think, to me, I think that story is actually Wallace perfection. There are moments in The Pale King, but I'm so conflicted about The Pale King because I don't know what he wrote versus what the editor did, you know? And I mean, all kinds of adulation to Michael Peach for putting all that together. I'm sure that was no easy task at all, but I have a really hard time. I'm okay saying that David Foster Wallace wrote The Pale King. I'm not okay saying that David Foster Wallace is the author of The Pale King. And if that's the reason that it did not win the Pulitzer, I am totally on board with that. So yeah, I don't know, but there are some moments there that the way that it opens, that sort of pan to the Midwest, like I've lived in Ohio basically all my life, and I get that, like everything that he's talking about there, the Tornado Alley and all this sort of stuff, like that responds to me. When I first got that book, I remember I ordered a digital copy and I pre-ordered the physical copy. It showed up a little bit early, and I brought it to work that day and I read it to lunch, and I opened the book and I started reading, and I literally started crying. Now, I don't cry. That's not a thing. And I definitely have a rule about not crying at work. But here I was crying at work because that opening to The Pale King, two things. Number one, I felt like I was mourning a friend who had passed away. But number two, that resonated with me so deeply, being from the Midwest, that it just, I mean, I really did.
And that's crazy to me. And that section that was published as the opening of The Pale King came out in a journal in like 2002.
Right.
And so The Pale King was published in 2011. And so like that was old news to me, man. Like reading that opening, I felt like was out of place with the rest of the thing about taxes.
Oh, it's
like
totally
IRS.
Yeah, it's totally out of place. Absolutely. It's still beautiful, but it doesn't honestly really belong in that book, in my opinion, but it's beautiful. So I'll take it.
Yeah, no, and I think it is one of the most poetic things he ever wrote.
Yeah.
And I think that it warrants publication in a book. I just, going back to your earlier point, whether or not he's the author of that book is, that speaks to that. Like, would he have selected that as the opening of the book? I don't know.
I don't know.
Our friend Tim Groenland, who is the guest on episode 5, he has a book coming out next year called The Art of Editing, Raymond Carver and David Foster Wallace, which I'm hopeful, it's out on Bloomsbury Press in February. I'm hopeful that it will kind of illuminate some of this stuff more for us, because that's kind of like the main research area that he's spent a lot of time in, is the editing and publication of The Pale King.
Wow.
So fingers crossed, Tim will shine some light on some of this for us.
I mean, and that's an interesting thing with like a lot of other authors who, they have their affairs in order before they pass. They know, like, don't publish this or do publish that. It'll be interesting to see, like what you said with Pynchon, you've sort of accepted that Bleeding Edge could be his last book, but there's got to be a box of stuff that he's just never published that will see the light of day some point.
I'm honestly not entirely sure. I have this idea that he wrote a few short stories, got them published. While he was working on those, he was also working on V. Then he started working on The Crying of Lot 49 and started doing at least research on Gravity's Rainbow simultaneously. There's this whole theory that he basically published The Crying of Lot 49 in order to have money so that he could write Gravity's Rainbow. That's may or may not be true. Then he wrote Gravity's Rainbow, he published it, and then he basically disappeared for a really long time. He came out with this collection of short stories, but that was effectively, just like, hey, the publisher says I should give you something. And then he comes back with Vineland. I think that during that time, he was writing and researching Mason and Dixon and Against the Day. Against the Day came out in 2006, I think he had it mostly written by the late 80s. And
wow.
and
That'd be a huge gap.
yeah, and I in the sort of the smaller books that came out, like Vineland and Inherent Vice and things like that, like I think those are more indicative of what he's written more or less contemporaneously to when they came out. Like obviously he didn't start Bleeding Edge until at least 2001. But I would say he probably started it more like 2009 or something, like, somewhere around there, just based on some of the things that are mentioned in that book and how they fall out later on. So yeah, I actually think, I honestly don't know that he has. I think he's published what he's want to publish at this point. If he has another book, I think it might be another one of those shorter ones, I should say. I think it's possible, and this is me being hopeful, like I rarely am. I think it's possible that he does have one massive book left that he is specifically waiting until he is passed away to publish. Like I would love to see that. I don't know that, even though that's going to add at least another 2 to 3 years to our podcast, I would love it.
Do you do the editing for your podcast, Bo?
I do. Well,
so I understand why you want it to end.
Yeah, and actually in this current season, Og has been helping out with the editing, so it's been easier. But also, like, now that Chris has left the podcast, I'm hosting. I kind of feel like the Bare Naked Ladies after Steve left, and he's just got to figure out a way to go on. And so yeah, I've been hosting, so on that I have more responsibility there, but Og's been helping out with editing, so less responsibility there. It's been a fairer balance that way. But
yeah, nice.
Yeah,
I think about that sometimes, Matt. Like, what would happen if Matt just couldn't do the show anymore? Like, what would happen to this podcast?
You'd be fine.
Would I try and find someone else? Would we just wrap it? Like, man.
I could recommend a dozen people who could do this better than me. So you'd have no problem.
I can think of some great people as well, but better, I don't think so, dude.
I really struggled with the decision. As I suppose a lot of I keep thinking of it in terms of a band.
Yeah, totally.
But to me, what it came down to was, I feel like we had at least implied that we were going to cover all of Pynchon's books. We may not have stated that directly. We certainly didn't promise that.
Yeah.
But I feel like we implied it over the years. And I feel like, he left right at when we finished Gravity's Rainbow, and that during that season we picked up at least twice as many listeners as we had before. So, a dozen listeners now.
Yeah, that's what happens when you do a podcast about like a kind of vanishingly obscure topic of interest.
And yeah, I really struggled with what to do, and what it was for me. What I feel like we didn't create a community, but we helped a community find itself.
Yeah, that's cool.
And we gave people who were fans of this relatively obscure or at least difficult author a place to talk to each other. And I didn't want to let that go. So that's why I decided to carry on, without Chris. But I spent a good month, maybe more, debating about it. And I emailed everybody who's currently on the show saying, are you guys still in? Or, all this, does anybody else want to host? There was like crickets at that point.
Yeah.
It was hard. It was, but eventually I just decided that's what I felt was the right thing to do.
Yeah. Cool. So I guess that kind of, as we're thinking about winding down here, brings up, and we sort of covered this a little bit, but like, what's it like to do a literary podcast? Like, what motivates you? Why do you do it? What is the continued value? What's like a day in the life for Bo Butler doing this podcast?
So as I think, Matt, you said before, our podcast is a little different than yours. You know, what motivates me is I am absolutely interested in getting people to read the hard books, because the great books of literature are great for a reason. And a lot of times they're hard for the same reason.
Yeah, totally.
So I'm very interested in sort of helping people over the hurdles and I'm not saying that I'm an authority on it, but that's why people have, apparently at least since the dawn of ARPANET, sat around and talked about books. And so that's what it is. It's this, I like what you guys do, and I like that you take a different approach on this sort of stuff. But for me, I'm interested in, there's this kid who was assigned to read The Crying Lot 49 for his, sophomore literature class. Can I help him get through that book and then maybe pick up Gravity's Rainbow?
Yeah, cool.
That's what gets me going. Now, I both love and hate the social media aspect of the world these days.
Sure.
And it's sometimes like that part's really great. Sometimes it's less great. But there's that. But then the other part of it is like the people who are on the show with me, like Michelle, I've known for, probably 2 decades at this point or close to it.
Yeah.
But some of these others who are newer, like I've never met them. Most of them, but they're my friends, and especially as we were going through Gravity's Rainbow, like I felt like we were people who had really kind of gone through some shit together. Like that was a couple of years of work,
Good pun intended there.
Yeah. I told when we started that season, I told Chris, like, it is I kind of gave him a schedule of all this, and I said, it is absolutely possible that children will be born to panelists during the course of the show who currently do not exist.
Right.
And that actually turned out to be true.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, I mean, we spent like 2 years or so on that book. And
that's
that
serious.
was... Yeah, it was really, really serious. But, but coming through that, like I'm really happy every couple of weeks when I get together with them to talk about Pynchon. It's like, it's the world's most sadistic book club. And, I just really appreciate the people who are on the show with me.
Very cool.
Pretty sure no kid's born as a result of our show, but whatever.
I'm not sure that's what Bo exactly said.
Actually, Michelle...
That's all I focused on.
Our one panelist, Michelle, literally just had a baby, like, yesterday.
Oh, wow.
And
congrats,
I sort of
Michelle.
Congrats.
Yeah, congrats to her. She joked around that she was going to name the kid, the kid's name was going to be everybody's name on the podcast. I don't think that's what she did, but also Michelle's a little bit unhinged in a great way, so that's possible. But I figured it out, and I realized that that would have the conception would have been post Gravity's Rainbow season, pre Bleeding Edge season. So I think there might have actually been a kid born because of our podcast.
Oh, that's great. That's the most you can ask for, right?
Yeah.
That's why we come up here. Well, Bo, it's been so great talking to you, man. Thank you so much for coming on. Are there any kind of final last thoughts to do with Pynchon, Wallace, the intersections between them that we haven't covered yet that you wanted to touch on but we haven't yet?
The only thing I really want to mention is that I feel like Wallace insisted that he was not influenced by Pynchon, or I think he might have even said that he never even read Pynchon.
Yeah, or at least Gravity's Rainbow specifically, maybe.
Specifically Gravity's Rainbow, and I want to call that out for the bullshit that it is.
Oh, absolutely.
For several reasons, but the most obvious thing to me is throughout Infinite Jest, there's that whole conversation between Marath and Steepley. And it takes place on this, outcropping over Tucson, and there's all this business about their shadows and all that. There is a scene in Gravity's Rainbow that is almost identical to that. There's one male character, one female character, although this one isn't putatively female. She's actually female. And they're on the Brocken, and there's the whole Brocken-Gepinched phenomenon, right? And it's that whole idea, like their shadows playing out over all of the land below them. And that, I mean, that's also, it's also used a little bit in Goethe's Faust, but let's just say the special effects are different. And Wallace definitely borrowed his special effects from that particular scene in Gravity's Rainbow. So I just want to throw that little bit of textual evidence out. and people, you can, if you want to hate on me, you can hit me up on Twitter. It's fine. It's at the real Bo Butler. Throw your hate my way. I'm good with it. So,
man, I don't know if anyone would dispute the influence of Pynchon on Wallace, and that Wallace was BSing that.
Yeah,
idea.
No one would dispute it except for Wallace.
Yeah, totally.
Well, and what's maybe his first published interview with Wall Street Journal in 1987 when Broom of the System came out, they compared him with Pynchon, and he had some response like, well, he sticks his lower lip out and says like, well, I'm my own person too. I mean, kind of acknowledging that, yes, he had read, a lot of Pynchon, but he was, trying to not be compared with him at every turn.
Sure.
Because, I think in Broom of the System, there was a lot of kind of cartoonish character names and scenes that brought him comparison with Pynchon.
Right.
So I think it's something from, like I say, his first published interview. That was what the interviewer asked him. And it was like a thing that he tried to separate himself from. So,
and I can respect that. I really can.
Yeah.
At the same time, you're being interviewed in the Wall Street Journal, and they're comparing you somewhat favorably to Thomas Pynchon. Take that for the compliment that it is.
Not bad.
Yeah.
Not bad.
Yeah, there are worse things
on your first outing too.
Like yeah. So
that's pretty great. Cool. Awesome, Bo. Where can people find your show online?
You can find us at pynchoninpublic.com. You can also find the podcast in, iTunes, Google Play, all that sort of stuff. We don't do Stitcher because Stitcher is weird. But otherwise, if you just do a search for Pynchon in Public, you can also follow the podcast at Pynchon Pod on Twitter, or just search us on Facebook at Pynchon in Public. You find us there. And as I mentioned before, you can find me at the real Bo Butler.
Mm-hmm. And you totally should follow Bo. His account is hilarious. Your presence on Twitter is one of my favorite.
Thank you.
Particularly the stuff around our podcast beef just had me in stitches when that started coming out. It was great.
From the moment I learned of you guys, I've never thought of it in any other way but that fight scene in Anchorman.
Yeah,
that was the
great.
First thing that came to my mind, and it has lasted till right now. I don't know why.
Get a trident.
Yeah.
Sharpen his trident.
I picture myself just holding a grenade,
I'm glad that in reality there's actually no physical harm coming my way. So.
Sure.
Yeah. Matt, where can the people find us?
We're pretty much at Concavity Show everywhere, I think.
Yeah, pretty much.
Concavity Show at Twitter, Instagram.
Concavity Show at gmail.com.
Yeah, email us. We should have end of the year show coming soon, which I'm excited about.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to review the year.
I'm looking forward to that. I like this.
And we'll talk about video games this year because I got some good ones. We could hang out after Bo and talk more about that if you want.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna drop,
and then Matt will be out. We also want to thank some new patrons who, between last episode and this episode, have started supporting us there. We want to thank our friend Corey Baldoff, who was the guest on episode 4, and also again on episode 17. Joe Disney, Kevin Twitchell, Eric Garibaldi, Joe McLaughlin, and Tiffany Walker. Thank you guys so much for supporting us and helping us out, continue doing the show. If you want to check out our Patreon, it is patreon.com/PynchonInPublic. www.concavityshow, I think, something like that. We'll link to it in the show notes, whatever that is. And as always, we want to thank Robin O'Neill and Andrew Savage of the band Parquet Courts for their generous artistic licenses for the things associated with our show. Once again, this has been episode 43 with Bo Butler. Bo, thanks so much, man. This has been really fun talking to you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Really it's been great.
Awesome. Keep up the good work with Pynchon in Public.
Hey, you guys keep it up too.
All right. Thanks.
All right.
Catch me now as I sing. Into darkness, I thought to be extinct.
Well, thanks for joining us, Bo. This is gonna be fun. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really am. I don't know. This is weird and exciting. Also, because I'm not in charge of hosting and levels, I've poured myself a little drink.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you were on White Russian or Black Russian tonight. Or